Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Classroom's course, The History of Economic Thought, Part 1. I'm Robert Murphy, your instructor, and we're now on Lecture 7, which is still Adam Smith, and this is the second of two lectures on Adam Smith in recognition of his importance in the history of economic thought. So I am in the outline, if you're following along on the PowerPoints. I'm continuing the lettering from the previous one, so now we're picking up on Part E, the origin of money, so it's consistent with the letters that we had in the outline from the previous lecture. So again, for this lecture, I am just going to be grabbing excerpts from The Wealth of Nations and discussing them to give you a little flavor of what Smith is talking about in the context and the relationship to more modern expositions. Again, let me stress, if you want to, your time is limited and you're saying, well, I want to read some of this stuff. I mean, David Hume is great, and I suppose if you had to choose, I would say go into Hume in terms of just, I think his writing style is more impressive, and you feel like you're reading this old-timey author. But if you want to just see a bunch of remarks on economics that are surprisingly good for a book that came out in 1776, you're not going to get bored just going through The Wealth of Nations. Even as I was trying to go through for the preparation for you guys and decide what stuff am I going to put in there. I mean, I was going down rabbit holes and reading stuff. I was like, whoa, I got to get back to working on the lecture here, even though that's fascinating. Okay, so Smith discusses the origin of money, so let me read you an excerpt and discuss it. But when the division of labor first began to take place, this power of exchanging must frequently have been very much clogged and embarrassed in its operations. One man, we shall suppose, has more of a certain commodity than he himself has occasion for, while another has less. The former consequently would be glad to dispose of, and the latter to purchase, a part of this superfluity. But if this latter should chance to have nothing that the former stands in need of, no exchange can be made between them. All right, and then in the text, which I have given you in your notes for this lecture, Smith goes on, with a specific example of people of a certain occupation, to make it very tangible and real for you. So the way we teach it a lot of times nowadays, the principle, what we call it, is the problem of the double coincidence of wants. And so the idea is that for a barter exchange to take place, or more specifically, a direct exchange where one person is giving up a good or commodity that the other person wants to use in order for the first person to get a commodity he wants to use because he values that thing he's getting more than the thing he's giving up, and vice versa on the part of the other person, and where, again, they both want to directly use the thing they're getting, that they're not just grabbing it or acquiring it with the aim of trading it away to somebody else down the road. That necessity, for that to work, you have to have a double coincidence of wants. It's not just that you find somebody out there who has something you want more than the thing you have and you'd be glad to make a trade, but the opposite has to be true for that person, right? So two kids at school, Jimmy has bologna for lunch and he sees Sally has peanut butter, and Jimmy thinks, oh, I would much rather have a peanut butter sandwich than bologna, so I'd be willing to trade sandwiches. But if Sally says, no, I don't feel the opposite, no trade's going to take place. All right, so even though direct exchanges are a win-win situation, both parties walk away with more subjective happiness than they went into the trade with, that by itself would be limited. And so again, the context here, we're trying to explain, where does money come from? And so ultimately, Smith recognizes that money solves this problem. If instead of having to find somebody who has the thing you want and who wants the thing that you have, if instead everybody follows this convention of doing all their sales against one particular commodity that's universally acceptable to everybody in trade, well, now this is fine. All you need to do is find somebody who has the thing you want, and if you have money, you can buy it, and that's the end of the story. Or when you have something you want to unload because you want to acquire something else, all you need to do is find somebody who wants it, and then they pay you money, and then you take the money and go find somebody who has the thing you want, right? So it's sort of breaks it up, and it allows you to break those exchanges up into different people, as it were. And so if you just think through the implications of that, you can see why it actually greatly expands our network of possible win-win trades, or I should say win-win-win trades, if you have now multiple people involved. Okay, so you can come up with examples, and I've done this, for example, in my Lessons for the Young Economist book and my book Choice. You can come up with pretty simple examples of where there's three people, and they each start out with they each start out with one good, and imagine that if you just took every good and moved it clockwise on the diagram, one person, then they'd all be better off. But yet, you could have the preference rankings such that any two people taken at a time have no gain from trade, right? That one person wants what the other guy has more than what he starts out with, but not vice versa. Even though, again, if you arrange them all like in a triangle and move their goods one unit clockwise, then they'd all be better off. Nonetheless, if you're forced to do it in terms of individual bilateral trades, one at a time, then nothing happens. Okay, so in that kind of scenario, if somebody had money, then that could solve the problem. Okay, so Smith recognized this, even though a lot of times Austrians, when they talk about the origin of money, start quoting Menger, and when we get to Menger, we're going to do that too. And Menger's book came out in 1871, whereas Smith in 1776 already understood this issue of the double coincidence of wants. Okay, so Smith is explaining the origin of money and why do we use money? How come we don't just engage in direct barter transactions all the time? But there's another issue. Why is it that money so often, historically, and certainly in all the advanced economies by the time Smith is writing, why is it that the money is of the form of the precious metals? I don't have time in this lecture to go through it. It's in some of your excerpts that Smith goes through and shows how historically all sorts of things have been money, like cattle and tobacco and whatever, things like that. But why is it in the commercial advanced nations the precious metals have been the money that the merchants settled upon? So here's Smith. In all countries, however, men have been determined to give the preference for this employment to metals above every other commodity. And there I have some ellipses. I'm skipping words in the interest of brevity. Metals can not only be kept with as little loss as any other commodity, scarce anything being less perishable than they are, but they can likewise, without any loss, be divided into any number of parts, as by fusion those parts can easily be reunited again, a quality which no other equally durable commodities possess. Okay, so there he's stressing two attributes of the precious metals, like gold and silver, that are crucial in understanding why they're such good monies. All right. So again, number one, their durability. That if you have a bar of gold and you leave it in your basement for 50 years and come back, it's still going to be sitting there. Whereas if your money is cattle and you leave the cattle in your basement for 50 years and come back and look at it, it's not going to be in the same state that it was when you left it. But also, you can take a bar of gold and break it in half. And then if you want to put it back together again, you can, and it's still just as good a bar as gold as it was before, assuming there wasn't, some numismatic value of the particular shape that it was in originally. But you're not going to ruin it by breaking it in half. Whereas, even something like diamonds, you might say, well, how come diamonds historically weren't money, even though they're obviously, beautiful and very valuable, but they weren't good as money? Because if you take a big diamond and cut it in half, you can't put it back together again. Whereas you take a chunk of gold and you cut it in half, then you can just melt it and put it back together and let it harden up again, and it's fine. So those properties explain why the precious metals served as money. And then Smith later on also talks about their relative exchange value. And so that's another reason to understand that you wouldn't want something that was really, really common to be, even if it were metal and were durable and easily divisible, that wouldn't be a good money, right? So, gold and silver made better metal than copper or bronze or something, right? And On the other hand, you wouldn't want something that was super, super rare. Like, platinum coins aren't very popular. And that's just because, so when you think through why is that, it's just historically for large transactions, to buy things that were expensive, you could use gold. And so you wouldn't need to have that much weight of gold to buy really expensive stuff. And then you could use silver, for smaller transactions. And so in terms of the amount of coins you'd want to be carrying around in a bag or something, that wasn't so onerous. Okay, and let me just give you now some miscellaneous remarks on money. Okay, he talks about the function of coins. So here, this is, again, it's hard for us, if you've grown up in a world of fiat money and haven't studied the history of it, it's hard to even think like this, but where I'm coming from is that nowadays, like if you're in the United States, what makes something a quarter? Well, it's not the content of the metal that embodies the quarter. It's the fact that it's this certain metal disc that's stamped in a certain way by the U.S. government, and that's what legally makes it a quarter. It's fiat money. It's just a token. There's nothing, valuable in the quarter itself. Whereas historically, when you had commodity money, like when if you were in a country where gold was the money, the money was weights of gold. It was a physical. How much metal do you have? How many kilograms or how many pounds? And that were, or ounces or grams. That was what made up the money. And so if you had to buy something, strictly speaking, what the merchant wanted was for you to hand over a certain physical weight of this metal. And that's how you bought the thing. So the function of taking gold or silver and melting them down and then stamping out coins with particular markings and grooves around the circumference of the coin and so forth, the only function of that was not to turn the gold or the silver into money. No, the gold and silver already were money by the nature of them being gold and silver. But the point is that it would be hard for you as an average person to evaluate if somebody tries to buy something from you and they start handing over hunks of metal and they say, yeah, that's silver, trust me. Or, and then they say, oh, this is 5 ounces of silver, there you go. Well, if they were just handing over odd chunks of it, you'd first of all have to weigh it, and then you'd also have to come up with some way of determining, is this really silver, or is this guy, trying to defraud me? Is he giving me something that's actually not silver and claiming it is, even though, maybe it looks like it's silver, but maybe it's not. And so that's what the function of making official-looking coins was. It was just to certify that this hunk of metal actually is 1 ounce of silver or is 1/2 ounce of gold. And so, by stamping it in a certain way and putting markings on it that would be hard to counterfeit, the mint would be performing that social service of taking hunks of metal and stamping it in a certain way so that the members of the community could very quickly identify that as, oh, yes, that really is, I'm pretty sure, 1 ounce of silver. I don't have to get out a scale, and I don't have to subject it to all sorts of chemical tests and whatever to really verify that it is 1 ounce of silver. Okay, so that's historically the function of a mint in terms of producing coins for the public when you're on a commodity standard. Okay, what about the actual names of the denominations of various countries' currencies? Smith has a cute little digression where he explains how a lot of terms for money units go back to historically when they were represented weights of gold or silver. All right, and so for our purposes, the most obvious example that survives to our usage is the British pound, right? A pound in the English system is a unit of weight, and yet it also signifies a unit of their currency, and that's not a coincidence. All right, so Smith, like I say, has a little digression where he talks about other examples of that to our ears don't sound as familiar, but the British pound is one that is still familiar. Okay, and then he also has a nice little treatment where he talks about the tendency of political rulers to debase their currencies. So here, even nowadays, when we talk about currency debasement, in the modern context, that just means like, oh, the central banks created a lot of dollars or a lot of euros or a lot of yen, and so that reduced the purchasing power of those currencies, and that kind of ripped off people who had assets denominated in those currencies. And that's what we mean now by debasement. But where the term came from historically was the fact that if you had, like, let's say you're the political ruler and you collect your tribute and taxes in the form of coins that are supposed to be 1 ounce of silver each, and so that, you know, all the prices in the community are denominated in terms of the silver coins, and that's what prices are quoted. You know, merchants are selling goods and services quoted in terms of, you know, how many coins, because they think that the coins contain 1 ounce of silver each. And so now you're the sovereign ruler. You collect all these coins. Let's say you have 1 million of them, and then you melt them all down. So now you just have a bunch of molten silver, and then you pour into that's a baser metal, you know, something that's not as valuable as silver. And so now you've increased the volume of the liquid, and now you make whatever 1.1 million coins. And so now, of course, each of those and you stamp it, whatever, to say it's officially 1 ounce of silver. So it looks to the average untrained eye as if it's the same kind of coin as before, even though now the silver content is lower than it was. And so if you do that and then try to, you know, the government owes people money contractually, it borrowed money and now owes somebody 1,000 coins, and it pays them back 1,000 coins. Well, but if those coins don't have as much silver as coins did when the contract was originally written up, Smith says that's a form of fraud. You're not paying your creditors what you actually owe them. Okay, so I really like that discussion because it just shows how commonplace it was back when everybody was on genuine commodity standards to think in terms of the money being weights of gold and silver, and not that money was just whatever units or tokens the political rulers said it was, which unfortunately nowadays in the age of fiat money, we tend to think that. I should stress it's a lot more nuanced than that, right? And maybe when we get to Mises in the next course, you know, I'll have time to walk through that, but I just want to make sure you don't get the wrong impression from me. Governments right now do not have the power to just turn something into money. They can't just say, these shells, we're going to make them legal tender and they're money. That's not enough to get the community to embrace it as a commonly accepted medium of exchange. Okay, but nonetheless, it certainly is true that through various mechanisms over the course of history, we've gotten to a point where people in the United States, for example, do accept green pieces of paper that have certain markings on it that the government says this makes it authoritative, and other green pieces of paper would not be considered money. Okay, use value versus exchange value. This is a big thing in terms of the thought of Adam Smith. So let me read the excerpt and then we'll discuss it. The word value, it is to be observed, has two different meanings and sometimes expresses the utility of some particular object and sometimes the power of purchasing other goods which the possession of that object conveys. The one may be called value in use, the other value in exchange. The things which have the greatest value in use have frequently little or no value in exchange. And on the contrary, those which have the greatest value in exchange have frequently little or no value in use. Nothing is more useful than water, but it will purchase scarce anything. Scarce anything can be had in exchange for it. A diamond, on the contrary, has scarce any value in use, but a very great quantity of other goods may frequently be had in exchange for it. Okay, so this is the famous water-diamond paradox. So again, the context is Smith wants to start talking about value, and he's going to be, discussing it. And this is humongous in terms of the history of economic thought, going from the classical economists through the 1870s marginal revolution. This idea of what is economic value and where does it come from and what principles determine its magnitude and that sort of thing. That is, I think it's probably safe to say that is the crucial distinction. and going, that what happened in the marginal revolution was they overturned the value theory of the classical economists and came up with a new subjective marginal utility approach to value. All right, so again, obviously we're going to talk about that more when we get to those writers in the 1870s, but for now I just wanted to stress that again. So here, what is Smith saying? He's saying, look, we talk about value, let's be careful. There's two different ways that term is typically used in discussions of, these topics that we nowadays will call economics. So one thing you might mean is something valuable in its direct usefulness to the person who owns it. Now, the other thing we might mean by saying is it valuable is it valuable in the marketplace? Can I go exchange it for a lot of other things? All right, and so then Smith says, to try to illustrate this distinction, he's saying that it's perhaps odd that sometimes, well, he doesn't just say sometimes, he says frequently. He's saying that things that are very valuable to the individual in terms of the direct usefulness don't have a high exchange value in the marketplace. And the classic example, that would be water. That you say, can the individual use water? Is it valuable in use to an individual? And I say, yeah, I think so, because you would die without it. So water is one of the most useful, valuable things on the planet to an individual in terms of direct usefulness. But if you have a gallon of water and you might say, oh, wow, you know what? Instead of me drinking this, I'm going to go sell this in the marketplace because this is so this is something that will allow others to live. So they're probably going to give me a lot of stuff for it, right? Well, no, they're not. In normal circumstances, water is very cheap. You couldn't go in the marketplace and get a bunch of apples or a car or something by selling somebody a gallon of water, even though you could say water is extremely valuable. It's necessary for life. On the other hand, you got a pile of diamonds, and you say, what could you do with it? Is this very useful to you? And actually, most people would say, not really. I mean, yeah, I might take one of them and mount it on a ring and wear it on my finger or something, or I don't know, make it an earring, or especially if you're a woman, you might say, oh yeah, I could use some of it, but there's really not that much you can do with it except to show it off for ornamental purposes. It's certainly not going to make the difference between you living or dying. Diamonds aren't necessary for life. So you could see, in one sense, you would think diamonds aren't that valuable in use value. And so, if I take these pile of diamonds in the marketplace, I bet you I'm not going to get much for it. Why? Just something people flaunt around because they look pretty. Probably no one's going to, well, no, you'd be wrong again. You go in the marketplace and get a whole boatload of apples or, a car or whatever. If you have a pile of diamonds, they have a very high exchange value. Okay, so here we don't have time. I'm not going to go into Smith's discussion of what constitutes use value and exchange value and what principles regulate them and so on. But this is a very famous passage, especially for people who are trying to teach the marginal revolution. So let me try to avoid misunderstanding or caricatures. As always, as you're going to hear me say over and over again in this course, these older thinkers were not morons. Okay, Adam Smith wasn't dumb. He understood, it wasn't like he was sitting there flummoxed and said, geez, I have no idea. Why is this the case? No, he knew it had something to do with relative scarcity. I mean, so that, in case I'm losing you, that's really the issue. And even as I was trying to explain the water diamond paradox, I was almost like giving the explanation, so I was having to mentally take a detour to not just come out and say it. But notice when I was even just walking you through that discussion, I was saying, okay, you got this gallon of water, and I'm probably going to be able to fetch a lot in the marketplace, right? Because someone needs it or else they'll die. No, actually, that's not true. You don't need this particular gallon of water. If you did find someone in the marketplace who, for some reason, had no other access to water, and the gallon in my hand really was going to be the difference between life and death for that person, then he would give me his car for it. All right? He would pay me more for that gallon of water than he would for a pile of diamonds. if he was, on the verge of dying of thirst, and this gallon in my hand was the only one he had access to. Okay, but in practice, the reason other people do, think of it this way: why am I selling the gallon of water in the marketplace if I need it to survive? And the answer is, well, no, you actually don't need that particular gallon to survive. You need water in general. You need other gallons, but you have plenty of gallons. That's why you're willing to take one of them and go to the marketplace and see what you can get for it. And so that's the solution, even though that's obvious. But until economists in the 1870s engaged, and that's why they call it the marginal revolution, that's what that term means in terms of thinking on the margin and saying, we're not going into the marketplace and in one fell swoop selling all the water in the world against all the diamonds and then being surprised how come the diamonds are more valuable than all the water. No, at any moment you're just selling particular units of water or diamonds, and once you frame it that way, it's totally obvious why, or perhaps another way of putting it is the use value of this particular gallon of water is not necessarily that high, because if you took it away from me, what uses now would not be satisfied? Well, it's not that I would say, oh, I guess I'm not going to be able to drink water anymore for the rest of my life, the next 2 days of it. No, if you took away this particular gallon of water, I would rearrange the other gallons at my disposal so that the thing I sacrificed was some very relatively unimportant use to which I had been putting water. I wouldn't say, I guess I'm not going to drink anymore. I guess I'm not going to take a shower anymore. I would say, okay, the next time I wash my car, I won't spend so much time on the back bumper because now I have one fewer gallon of water. Okay, so that's the use versus exchange value, and you can see how this paves the way for later on what would be what we're going to call the marginal revolution. Okay, the labor theory of value. Here's Smith. Every man is rich or poor according to the degree in which he can afford to enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life. But after the division of labor has once thoroughly taken place, it is but a very small part of these with which a man's own labor can supply him. The far greater part of them he must derive from the labor of other people, and he must be rich or poor according to the quantity of that labor which he can command, or which he can afford to purchase. The value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it, and who means not to use or consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. Labor, therefore, is the real measure of the exchangeable value of all commodities. Okay, so boom, there you have it. That's one illustration of Adam Smith's labor theory of value. So you may have thought this was something Karl Marx invented, and au contraire, mon frère. Or I guess I should say, oh no, my brother, because I want to stress this is coming from the British school, not the French, that it's the labor theory of value came from the guys that many people consider to be the free market economists. So yes, Karl Marx had a labor theory of value, and yes, Karl Marx can be considered a classical economist, but Karl Marx did not invent the labor theory of value. He got it from the earlier classical writers, including Adam Smith. All right. So here, there's no way of getting around it. This is just wrong. All right. When you think through the logic of value and so on, this is just wrong. It's not true that the value of any commodity, therefore, to the person who possesses it and who means not to consume it himself, but to exchange it for other commodities, is equal to the quantity of labor which it enables him to purchase or command. That's simply not true. I can give you a contrived example to really drive home the point, but you can see how in general it's not true. Somebody stumbles upon a barrel of oil in his backyard, and then I have some apples that came off of my tree. And so I have in my possession apples. I have eaten as many apples as I can tolerate. I don't want any more of these apples, but still I got a bunch of them. And so I say to that person, hey, let me trade you these apples for that barrel of oil because I could use that. And he says, okay. Well, what I've just acquired there, it's not the labor, right? It's not like, oh, wow, by selling, by giving up all these these bunches of apples that I have, now I'm sparing myself the labor of getting oil myself, or I'm getting the labor of that guy who, took 15 minutes to go take that barrel and roll it over in his backyard and put it under the gushing thing where oil's oozing out and filling it up. And so these apples, really, when you think about it, I used to purchase that 15 minutes of labor time from that guy. No, you used it to get the barrel of oil. It's the barrel of oil that you find useful, and it's just not true to say the barrel of oil ultimately gets its value from the fact that that guy took 15 minutes to go get it. It's not really the guy's labor that, for just about anything, some human labor is going to be involved, but that doesn't mean human labor is the source of all value and is the standard by which we should measure it. Instead, it's subjective valuation. Why do I value that barrel of crude oil? Well, because I can think of all the things I can do with a barrel of crude oil that I can't do without it, and I get more happiness from those things or more utility from those things. And so that's the way I value that barrel of oil. That's the procedure I go through to figure out how many apples should I be willing to give up for that thing. It's incidental that the guy's labor is partially involved to help get me that barrel. Even if he didn't have any labor at all, right? Suppose the guy has, pigs running around his backyard. Wild pigs. He has nothing to do with. He inputs no labor whatsoever, but he's got a fence around his yard. And I say, hey, I got a bunch of apples. I want to grab one of your pigs. I'll do all the work. Are you giving me permission to hop your fence and go grab one of those pigs and bring it over to my property? And he says, yeah, if you give me a bunch of those apples. Okay, so there clearly his labor has nothing to do with it. And yet my apples are valuable to me, even though I don't want to consume them myself, because I realize, I can trade them and get one of those pigs. So clearly the value, involved in that transaction has nothing to do with the owner's labor power. Okay, protecting industries. The general industry of the society never can exceed what the capital of the society can employ, as the number of workmen that can be kept in employment by any particular person must bear a certain proportion to his capital, so the number of those that can be continually employed by all the members of a great society must bear a certain proportion to the whole capital of that society, and never can exceed that proportion. No regulation of commerce can increase the quantity of industry in any society beyond what its capital can maintain. It can only divert a part of it into a direction into which it might not otherwise have gone, and it is by no means certain that this artificial direction is likely to be more advantageous to the society than that into which it would have gone of its own accord. Okay, so that was kind of long, and you may want to have at least the PowerPoint in front of you, or better yet, go get the notes that I made up for you guys that have bigger excerpts. But it's a little bit awkwardly phrased, but I think what he's trying to say here is very valid and it's important. So let me paraphrase it. He's trying to say when we're trying to figure out how much total output can our society produce with its workers and capital equipment, that's the fund with which we produce all the goods and services that we then consume over the course of the year. And so, if the government wants to protect certain industries by shielding them from foreign imports, that can channel domestically, that can channel more capital and workers into some lines that we're now shielding from foreign competition. And so output in those lines can increase. So if that's all you're narrowly looking at, it might look like, oh, that's good. So we keep out foreign wine, and that gives stimulus to our domestic wine production. And lo and behold, if we bar foreign wine bottles from coming into our country, the sales and production and employment figures for our domestic wineries goes up. So, hey, that's a good thing. We boosted output. Who could be against that? And Smith is pointing out, well, wait a minute, but you're only doing that because the capital and workers that were in other industries now just got rearranged. They got sucked or siphoned off into wine production, but now they're not in those other lines. So it's not that your total national output has gone up. It's just you've rearranged its composition. And it's not obvious why you would want to do that, or why is that a good thing? Okay, so that's when you frame it like that, that's a crucial point, that you can't just narrowly focus on the particular industries that are, quote, protected by tariffs or outright prohibitions on imports, that all that does is rearrange domestic production. It doesn't actually increase in the aggregate total domestic production. So just a crippling blow to the mercantilist agenda. Okay, and now finally, as we're wrapping up here, let's talk about the celebrated metaphor, or is it a metaphor? That's what we'll talk about, of an invisible hand. So here's the money quote, and then we'll discuss. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends, so he's talking about somebody who's in your society who's like a capitalist and who's, trying to think about what does he want to do with his capital, and does he want to bring in foreign goods, or does he want to produce domestically, that kind of stuff. So let me start again. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security. And by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. Okay, so again, that's obviously ridiculously famous. So what is he talking about here? Well, it's in the context of domestic versus foreign industry, and this is part of his case against the need for your government to protect industry from foreign competition. Smith is saying that, no, just go ahead and let people do what they want, and they will put their capital to the most profitable uses. And that's really what you want. So one way of putting it is, if every merchant does what is most profitable for himself, well, then in the aggregate, that's going to be the thing that maximizes the wealth of the country. All right. So that's just one way of thinking about it in this case. So again, here in this particular example, in this context, Smith is narrowly talking about, should we worry about people doing things that hurt domestic industry and give advantages to the foreign industries? But he also is acknowledging this is a more general point, that in general, when we let people in the marketplace follow their own inclinations, pursuing their own self-interest, actually they end up promoting the welfare of their fellow men and women. Okay, so that's what it means there. Let me address some misconceptions. So I used to think, before I taught the history of economic thought, I thought what Smith said was that the person was led as if by an invisible hand. That was the way I thought the quote read, and it was only until I actually went and got The Wealth of Nations and read the quote myself that I realized, wait a minute, it doesn't say as if, it just says led by an invisible hand. All right, and so in this context, it's important to know that Adam Smith was a deeply religious person, and there's plenty of passages in the Theory of Moral Sentiments that would make us think that he is very comfortable with the claim that there is a God who, is a personal God or whatever, and, cares about human beings and designed our natures and the way the world works such that the very productive, talented people among us, very ambitious, so long as they respect property rights and other, rules of morality, they are led to unwittingly do socially beneficial things, right? So I think Adam Smith would say that's a great system. That's exactly the kind of system that God would make. That, we have our baser motives, if you will, and we're not trying to help people, but even when we're trying to get ahead and to become number one, we end up serving everybody. Like, isn't that hilarious? Isn't that the kind of thing God would do? Would make a system like that where people who are just trying to get rich and to have more money than everybody else end up doing that by making factories or whatever that cranks out television sets for the average person. That's the way you get rich in a capitalist society. Okay, so where did this other notion come from? Well, I tracked it. It's at least in Paul Samuelson's textbook. That in Paul Samuelson's famous text, he's disparaging Smith and saying this notion of the invisible hand has done a lot of damage because it leads people to think there's no role for government regulation. And just have laissez-faire and don't worry, everything will take care of itself. And Paul Samuelson thought that was horrible advice. And so in he doesn't misquote Smith, but Samuelson is talking about this and then says, so the Smith's, notion that the people are guided by as if by an invisible hand. So that for sure, at least in Paul Samuelson, that's where that as if comes in. And I've seen a lot of economists say that, attributing it to Smith, but that actually changes the nature. It makes it sound like Smith was just speaking of a metaphor, whereas, I think it's plausible that he really meant there was an invisible hand guiding things. Okay, that is the end of our lecture on Adam Smith. Obviously, there's all kinds of stuff we could touch upon. In conclusion, let me again stress that Smith destroyed the intellectual basis of mercantilism. All right, there were people who went on and got rid of what were called the Corn Laws. All right, in the course like this, we don't have time to go through all that, but this really was an example. It wasn't just that Smith was writing for some elite intellectuals, in their parlor rooms and 18 people read his book. No, this thing was very influential and ultimately played a big role, arguably. I mean, we can't know in terms of history what caused what, but certainly most people would say that, yes, this was a hugely important book, and the free market British classical economists definitely changed public opinion and changed government policy, and that's what's responsible for the period of relative free trade of the British Empire. Okay, so that's the end of Adam Smith, and I will see you guys next time.